There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them without ever questioning it. It is the version with clear sides, righteous causes, and an ending that felt like justice being returned to the world. It is the version taught in schools, commemorated in ceremonies, and repeated so often that it became something close to mythology. And like most mythology, it contains real events arranged in a way that makes them easier to live with. The war was real. The suffering was real. The scale of it was real. But the clarity, the moral cleanliness, the idea that the conflict sorted itself neatly into good and evil and that good prevailed, that part was constructed. It was constructed during the war, by governments who needed their populations to keep fighting. It was constructed after the war, by institutions that needed to continue existing. And it has been maintained ever since, not through any single conspiracy, but through the much more ordinary process of deciding what to remember and what to leave out. What was left out is the subject of this narration. Not the dramatic secrets, not the sensational revelations, but the quieter facts. The administrative ones. The ones buried in paperwork and procedural language and the kind of institutional silence that does not require anyone to make a decision to hide something. Things disappear from the record not always because someone chooses to erase them, but because the systems that generated them were designed to move forward, not to account for themselves. The war produced those systems in enormous quantities. It also produced the records those systems left behind, and in some cases, it produced people whose entire function was to ensure that certain records never became part of the official story. This is not about villains. That framing is part of the problem. The events described in this narration were not primarily the work of exceptional men doing exceptional evil. They were the work of ordinary men doing ordinary jobs inside structures that had made those jobs seem reasonable. The disturbing quality of what happened during the Second World War is not that it was monstrous, it is that it was routine. The Allied firebombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities are documented. They are not secret. But the internal deliberations that shaped them, the memos, the casualty projections, the frank acknowledgements that civilian deaths were not a side effect, but a mechanism, those documents existed in a different category for decades. They were classified, not because they revealed military vulnerability, but because they revealed something about the decision-making process that the governments involved preferred not to discuss publicly. The language in those documents is precise and professional. It does not read like the language of men troubled by what they were ordering. It reads like the language of administrators solving a logistics problem. The British approach to Germany's cities began with a formal policy shift in 1942. Before that shift, the official position was that Bomber Command targeted industrial infrastructure. After the shift, the target became something described in internal documents as the morale of the enemy civilian population, and in particular, of the industrial workers. The words are careful. They do not say that the goal is to kill civilians. They say the goal is to affect morale. But the operational reality was that affecting morale meant burning people in their homes. The planners knew this. It was in their own calculations. The casualty figures they projected in advance were not incidental. They were part of the argument for why the campaign would work. Arthur Harris, who commanded Bomber Command, was explicit in his internal correspondence in ways he was not in his public statements. He believed that bombing German cities to rubble, killing enough people, destroying enough homes, would either break the German will to continue or remove the physical capacity to do so. He pursued this belief with the systematic consistency of a man implementing a policy he had been authorized to implement. He requested aircraft. He requested crews. He requested bombs of specific types designed specifically for the purpose of starting fires in residential areas. He received them. The apparatus of a democratic government, with its committees and its approvals and its chains of authorization, produced those bombs and put them on those planes. It did so through a process that was entirely legal under the frameworks those governments had constructed for themselves. Dresden in February 1945 is the most discussed example, but it is in some ways the least representative. By February 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was not in serious doubt. The city had limited strategic value by that point. The decision to bomb it anyway, and to bomb it in the way that it was bombed, with incendiaries designed to create the kind of self-sustaining firestorm that would make rescue and escape impossible, was made through the same channels and with the same paperwork as every other bombing decision. What made it different was only that it happened late enough and visibly enough that questions were asked. The Royal Air Force conducted an internal review. The review's conclusions were classified. They remained classified for decades. The version of events that was presented publicly described a military necessity. The version in the classified documents was more complicated. The death toll estimates in those documents were also higher than the figures released publicly, and the discrepancy was noted internally and then set aside. The American firebombing of Japanese cities operated under different framing but similar logic. Curtis LeMay, who commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, was more candid than most of his counterparts about what he was doing. He did not use language about morale. He used language about destruction. His goal was to remove Japan's capacity to sustain a war economy, and he understood that Japan's war economy was distributed through small workshops and home industries spread throughout urban residential areas, which meant that destroying the urban residential areas was not a byproduct of the military campaign. It was the campaign. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9, 1945, killed more people in a single night than any other conventional bombing raid in history. The estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 dead in approximately 3 hours. LeMay reviewed the results. He ordered the same approach applied to 67 additional Japanese cities over the following months. The records of those planning sessions were maintained. They describe targets, fuel loads, bomb types, expected destruction radii. They do not contain expressions of doubt. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are discussed as a separate category of event, as something qualitatively different from everything that came before, and in some technical sense they were. But the decision-making process that produced them was not different. It went through the same committees, the same authorizations, the same careful language about military necessity and projected outcomes. The Target Committee, which was the actual body that selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki, produced minutes of its meetings. Those minutes are available and have been for some time. They are written in the language of engineers and military planners discussing a technical problem. The question of what would happen to the people in those cities is present in the documents, but it is present as a variable. The ideal target, as described in the committee's minutes, was a city large enough that the damage radius of the bomb would not extend beyond the city's boundaries, surrounded by a larger area of urban development, with structures susceptible to blast and fire. The people inside those structures appear in the documents primarily in the context of what their presence demonstrated about the effectiveness of the weapon. One of the things the Target Committee explicitly noted was that the selected cities should not have been significantly damaged by previous bombing. The reason given was scientific. An undamaged city would allow for a cleaner assessment of the weapon's effects. This is true. It is also true that it meant the populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been preserved as a kind of control group. This is not a rhetorical point. It is what the documents say. The record is clear. The German war in the East operated on a different scale of official documentation than almost anything else in the conflict. The Nazis were, among other things, compulsive record keepers. This is one of the reasons the historical record of the Holocaust is as detailed as it is. But the German military, separate from the SS and the party structures, also generated records, and some of those records document things that were officially attributed only to the ideological apparatus of the regime. The Wehrmacht, the regular German army, was involved in the murder of civilians, the starvation of prisoners, and the implementation of policies that had no military justification in any conventional sense, and it generated paperwork to that effect. Operational orders specifying that Soviet political commissars were to be shot immediately upon capture. logistical documents describing the deliberate reduction of food rations to Soviet prisoners of war to levels that ensured death within weeks. These documents were produced by military bureaucracies functioning normally. Officers signed them, clerks filed them. They moved through normal channels. The question of what to do with this record after the war was answered in a particular way. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted a portion of it. They prosecuted the most visible portions, the ones attached to the most prominent individuals. The broader institutional record, the one that implicated the German officer corps as a collective, was handled differently. There was a set of interviews and testimonies organized by American military historians and conducted with captured German generals, which became known informally as the Foreign Military Studies Program. German generals in American captivity were asked to produce accounts of their campaigns, their tactics, their operational decisions. They were helpful. They produced extensive, detailed, professionally written analyses that were genuinely useful to American military planners thinking about a potential war with the Soviet Union. In the course of producing these analyses, they presented a version of the German military's conduct that separated the professional army from the crimes of the regime. They described the Wehrmacht as a fighting force that had operated according to military tradition and had been used by a criminal leadership for purposes the military itself had no part in designing. This was not accurate, but it was useful. The American military had reasons to prefer that framing. The German officers who provided it had obvious reasons to prefer it as well. The resulting body of work was taken seriously and incorporated into American military doctrine. The men who produced it were, in several cases, eventually integrated into the new West German military established in the 1950s. The actual record of Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities was not unknown to the American officers who conducted these interviews. Some of those records had already been captured, but the program was not designed to adjudicate war crimes. It was designed to extract operational knowledge. It produced what it was designed to produce. The rest was set aside because setting it aside was convenient. American treatment of German scientists and technical experts after the war followed a similar logic in a more organized form. Operation Paperclip, which brought hundreds of German scientists to the United States, is documented and has been discussed publicly for decades. But the specific nature of what was documented about those individuals before they were brought to America and what happened to that documentation is worth examining in detail. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which ran the program, was required by existing policy to exclude anyone who had been an ardent Nazi or who had been involved in war crimes. The agency's own investigators, in many cases, produced reports that concluded that specific individuals did not meet the criteria for exclusion, reports that relied on information selectively presented and, in some cases, that contradicted other available evidence. Werner von Braun is the most famous example, His membership in the SS, his visits to the Mittelwerk facility where V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp prisoners under conditions that killed thousands of them, these were known. The decision to describe him as someone who had been compelled to join the SS and had not been involved in the treatment of the workers at Mittelwerk was a decision made by specific people in a specific institutional context. It was not an oversight. It was a determination that his value to the American rocket program outweighed the complications. The paperwork was adjusted to reflect the determination. He was admitted to the United States. He worked on American rockets. He was publicly celebrated. The Soviet Union conducted a parallel program, also well documented, in which German scientists and engineers were brought to the USSR and compelled to work on Soviet military and space programs. The Soviets were less interested in the biographical complications. They took who they wanted and used them. The Americans processed the paperwork more carefully. The outcome in terms of what it meant for the individuals who had been forced to build German rockets with slave labor, in terms of what it meant for accountability, was roughly the same. The treatment of prisoners of war by all major powers during the Second World War diverges significantly from the official accounts those powers maintained about themselves. The Soviet Union's treatment of German prisoners is documented and is relatively well known. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union during the war, a substantial portion, estimates range from 500,000 to over 1 million, died in captivity. The conditions in Soviet prisoner of war camps were frequently lethal, not always through deliberate policy, but through deliberate indifference. There was food sometimes, there was medicine sometimes, there was labor, always. The Soviet state did not hide that German prisoners were being used as labor. It treated this as an appropriate outcome of the war. The death rate was noted in internal documents. It was not considered a problem requiring a solution. The American and British treatment of German prisoners is less discussed. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Western Allies held several million German soldiers in a status that was not technically covered by the Geneva Convention. The legal mechanism was a designation created by Eisenhower's command called disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war. The distinction mattered because the Geneva Convention's protections applied to prisoners of war. They did not technically apply to disarmed enemy forces. The practical consequence of this distinction was that the rations and conditions that applied to the men in these camps were not required to meet the standards that would otherwise have applied. The camps, which held German soldiers in open fields in the Rhine Valley during the spring of 1945, were severely overcrowded. Food was inadequate. There was little shelter. Disease was common. The death estimates for these camps vary significantly and remain disputed, with figures ranging from several thousand to considerably higher. The American military's own records from the period are incomplete in ways that complicate any precise accounting. Some records from those camps were transferred to other filing systems. Some were not retained. The official American position, maintained for decades, was that conditions were difficult but not deliberately lethal. The classified internal reports from that period present a more complicated picture, one in which the inadequacy of the conditions was noted by officers in the field and addressed slowly and partially. The Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners of war is documented extensively and has been the subject of war crimes trials. What is less discussed is the American decision-making around the use of former Japanese prisoners of war officials. Several individuals who had been directly responsible for the administration of camps where Allied prisoners died were given immunity from prosecution in exchange for information, primarily information about biological weapons research. Unit 731, the Japanese military unit that conducted experiments on human subjects, including Chinese civilians and prisoners, is the most documented example. Shiro Ishii, who commanded the unit, was never prosecuted. The decision not to prosecute him was made at the highest levels of the American Occupation Authority, specifically to obtain the research data his unit had produced. The logic was identical to the logic of paperclip. The data had scientific value. The prosecution would have consumed that data in a legal process. The decision was made. Ishii died in Japan in 1959. Several other members of Unit 731 went on to careers in Japanese medicine and academia. The research data they provided to the United States was classified and remained classified for decades. The French conduct of the war in its colonial territories during and after World War II occupies a strange position in the standard historical narrative. The Vichy government's collaboration with Nazi Germany is documented and discussed. The Free French Resistance and the eventual liberation of France is celebrated. What falls between those two stories is the conduct of French forces in its colonial possessions, where the narrative of liberation from fascism coexisted with the violent suppression of independence movements. In Algeria in May 1945, in the days immediately following the German surrender and during the celebrations of victory over fascism in Europe, French forces and French settlers killed between 8,000 and 45,000 Algerians. The range of that estimate reflects the different sources using different methods. The French government's figure was much lower. The Algerian government's figure was much higher. What is not in dispute is that significant violence occurred, that it was carried out by French military and paramilitary forces, and that it occurred in the context of suppressing demonstrations by Algerians who had been told that the war's end would bring consideration of their political status. French military records from that period were classified for decades. Some were destroyed before they could be examined. The French government did not officially acknowledge the events as a massacre until 2005, 60 years later, and even then the acknowledgement was careful in its language. The British conduct in its colonies during and after the war follows a similar pattern. India experienced a famine in Bengal in 1943 that killed between 2 and 3 million people. The famine occurred in a province that was producing food throughout the period, but wartime policies, including the denial of food imports, the requisitioning of rice stocks for military purposes, and administrative decisions made in London and in Calcutta that prioritized other considerations, contributed to a mortality rate that did not have to be as high as it was. Winston Churchill's personal views on the famine are documented in his private communications. He expressed irritation about the attention being paid to it. He made remarks about Indians bringing their situation on themselves through their own habits of reproduction. The policy decisions that shaped the British response to the famine were not made by one man, but the framing of those decisions, the relative weight given to Indian lives versus other wartime priorities, reflects an institutional attitude that was shared widely enough to shape outcomes. The official British report on the famine, commissioned during the war and produced by John Woodhead, was released publicly but in a version that had been edited. The full version, which included a more direct assessment of policy responsibility, was classified. It became available much later. The role of neutral countries during the war is another area where the official record maintained for decades after the conflict diverged from what the documents showed. Switzerland is the primary example. The Swiss declared neutrality and maintained it throughout the war. They are generally credited with providing a refuge, with harboring refugees, with maintaining a space outside the conflict. This is partially true. Switzerland also served as a financial center through which Nazi Germany moved assets throughout the war. Swiss banks accepted gold deposits from Nazi Germany. Some of that gold had been taken from Jewish victims in Germany and occupied Europe. The Swiss National Bank was aware of the nature of some of these deposits. This was documented in the bank's own records. Those records were examined by a commission in the 1990s after political pressure produced the WWII Commission, which investigated Switzerland's wartime conduct over several years and produced a report that was detailed and frank in ways that Swiss official accounts had not been. The Commission found that Switzerland had been more integrated into the Nazi war economy than the official narrative suggested, that it had returned Jewish refugees to Germany, knowing what awaited them there, and that its neutrality had functioned in ways that were systematically beneficial to the Third Reich. The report was acknowledged. It changed the official Swiss narrative somewhat. The banks involved settled claims related to dormant accounts of Holocaust victims. The structural account of Swiss neutrality as a moral position rather than a practical calculation remains largely intact in popular understanding. Sweden's conduct during the war included the transit of German troops and military equipment through Swedish territory. Over 2 million German soldier transits occurred through Sweden over the course of the war. This was publicly known, but officially described by the Swedish government during the war as a temporary and reluctant concession to necessity made under duress. The internal Swedish government documents from the period, which were eventually examined by Swedish historians, present a more complicated picture of the deliberateness of those decisions. Sweden also supplied iron ore to Germany throughout most of the war through a trade relationship that the Swedish government maintained because it was economically significant and because the German military controlled the ports through which Swedish exports moved. The framing of Swedish neutrality as a moral stance rather than a practical calculation, similar to the Swiss case, persisted in Swedish national memory for decades longer than the documents could support. The experience of Black American soldiers during the Second World War contains a specific and well-documented set of institutional realities that the American military maintained through deliberate policy and actively worked to keep from becoming a public narrative during the war. Black soldiers served in segregated units. They were assigned disproportionately to labor and support roles. They faced discrimination from within the army through formal policy, not just through individual prejudice. The Red Cross maintained separate blood banks for black and white donors. This was military policy. It had no scientific basis. The scientists at the time knew it had no scientific basis. It was maintained anyway. Black soldiers who experienced discrimination in American military facilities in Britain and in the Pacific reported it through official channels. Their reports were logged and filed, and in many cases classified. The Army's own surveys of black soldiers, conducted to measure morale and to understand the sources of tension, documented the specific complaints in detail. Those surveys were treated as sensitive material. The German propaganda apparatus made use of American racial segregation, producing pamphlets and radio broadcasts aimed at black American soldiers that pointed out the contradiction between fighting a war for democracy abroad while being subjected to legal discrimination at home. The American military's response to this propaganda was not to address the conditions the propaganda described. It was to restrict the distribution of the German propaganda materials and to instruct officers to address the morale issues through other means. The documentation of this effort, the memos and the classified surveys and the restricted reports, existed within the military bureaucracy throughout the war and afterward. They were not a secret to the people inside the institution. They were a secret from the public narrative being maintained about what the American military was and what it stood for. The American incarceration of Japanese Americans is documented and has been officially acknowledged. What is less often discussed is the internal government documentation that existed before the decision was made. Documentation that assessed the actual security risk posed by Japanese American residents on the West Coast and concluded that it was not significant, that there was not evidence of widespread disloyalty or of organized espionage activity. The report produced by Curtis Munson, a businessman who conducted an investigation for the State Department in late 1941, concluded that Japanese Americans were not a security risk. This report was available to the decision-makers who implemented Executive Order 9266. It was not the basis for their decision. The decision was made on other grounds that included economic pressure from agricultural interests who wanted Japanese American farmland, political pressure from West Coast politicians, and a general institutional willingness to act on racial assumptions rather than on the available evidence. The Munson report existed. It was classified. It did not affect the outcome. The Italian campaign of the war produced a specific documented reality that was consistently underrepresented in the public accounts maintained by the Allied High Command. American troops in Italy committed acts of violence against Italian civilians that were documented in military police reports and in reports from the Allied Control Commission, which administered occupied Italian territory. These included theft, assault, and rape. The reports went through normal military channels. Some of them resulted in courts-martial. Many did not. The pattern across the Italian campaign, as documented in the reports themselves, showed a consistent gap between the reported incidents and the prosecutions. Officers were responsible for maintaining discipline and were also evaluated on the operational performance of their units. There was a structural pressure to handle disciplinary matters in ways that did not draw attention to the command. Reports that went up the chain of command sometimes were resolved at the level where they originated. The overall picture in the military police records is of an institution that tracked its own disciplinary failures in considerable detail and that had a limited institutional appetite for allowing those records to become part of the public account of the campaign. The French colonial troops who participated in the Italian campaign, specifically the Moroccan Goumiers, were the subject of a large number of documented atrocities against Italian civilians, particularly in the area of the Chioggiaria region following the Allied breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944. Italian accounts and French military records both document mass sexual violence against civilians in that area during that period. The French military command acknowledged internally that it had received reports. The public response was limited. The French army's official history of the Italian campaign does not discuss this material in the same way that the internal records document it. The Italian government formally raised the issue with France decades after the war. The response was diplomatic. It did not include the opening of the relevant French military archives in a comprehensive way. The conduct of the war in the Pacific included Japanese use of biological weapons against Chinese civilians throughout the conflict, beginning before the formal start of the Second World War and continuing through 1945. Unit 731 has been mentioned, but the broader Japanese biological weapons program included attacks on Chinese cities using plague-infected fleas, cholera-contaminated water supplies, and other methods. These attacks are documented in Chinese sources, in some Japanese sources, and in American intelligence records from the period. They were not prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which focused on other charges. The decision not to prosecute the biological weapons program at Tokyo was made partly because of the American interest in obtaining the research data and partly because of concerns about what the prosecution would reveal about the scale of Japanese activities that the American Occupation Authority would then have been responsible for fully documenting and adjudicating. The individuals responsible for those programs were not prosecuted. Some of them provided their research to American authorities. The public record of the Tokyo trials does not reflect the full scope of what was known at the time the trials were conducted. The relationship between the American intelligence services and former Nazi intelligence officers began during the war and was formalized in its most consequential form through a program that became known as the Gehlen Organization. Reinhard Gehlen had been the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, which means he had been responsible for intelligence operations conducted in Soviet-occupied and German-occupied territory throughout the most lethal period of the Eastern War. His networks in Eastern Europe had functioned alongside the German occupation apparatus. The nature of that occupation is documented. At the end of the war, Gehlen approached American military intelligence with an offer. He had records, networks, and knowledge of Soviet operations that would be valuable to the Americans in the anticipated confrontation with the USSR. The Americans accepted. The Gehlen Organization was established with American funding and operated under American oversight while being run entirely by former German intelligence officers. It eventually became the core of the West German Intelligence Service, the BND. The American records of how this arrangement was established, what was known about Gehlen's wartime activities, and what conditions were placed on the agreement were classified for decades. When they became available, they showed that the people who made the arrangement knew a considerable amount about the wartime context in which Gehlen had operated, and that the arrangement was made anyway because the Cold War had reorganized the priorities. Medical experimentation during the war was not confined to the programs conducted in the concentration camps, which are documented and known. American military and government-funded research during the war included experiments conducted on prisoners, on soldiers without full informed consent, and on civilian populations. The most documented examples involve malaria research conducted in American prisons, where inmates were infected with malaria as part of research into treatments and prophylactics. These experiments produced results that were medically useful and were used to develop treatments deployed to American troops in the Pacific. The prisoners who participated were compensated with small reductions in their sentences in some cases and with modest payments in others. Whether the conditions under which they consented constituted meaningful consent is a question that was not the subject of serious institutional examination during the war. The experiments were conducted under military contract, documented thoroughly, and produced scientific publications. The publications described the research subjects as volunteers. The fuller picture of how those volunteers were recruited and what alternatives were available to them as people in prison is available in the administrative records. The American military also sponsored research into the physiological and psychological effects of extreme cold, high altitude, and other conditions on human subjects. Some of this research was conducted on American service members under conditions that were not always clearly explained to the participants. The overlap between American research programs and the German research programs, whose results were obtained through paperclip-connected channels, is a subject that the relevant archives document, but that was not a subject of public discussion until long after the war. Some of the German research that was obtained through those channels and incorporated into American research programs had been conducted on concentration camp prisoners. The chain between that data and the American programs that used it was documented internally and was not documented publicly. The planning and execution of the D-Day landings in June 1944 involved a component that was almost entirely absent from public accounts for decades. Operation Overlord required that the Normandy beaches be surveyed in advance, that intelligence about German fortifications be collected, and that the Allied command have accurate information about conditions on the beaches themselves. Some of this information was collected through signals intelligence. Some was collected through aerial reconnaissance. Some was collected through other means that were not discussed publicly during or after the war, because discussing them would have revealed the methods and the sources involved. One source of intelligence was a network of French resistance members who moved through the occupied zones, collecting information at significant personal risk. The information they provided was valuable and is credited in internal assessments as having contributed to the success of the landings. The public accounting of the resistance's role was carefully managed during and after the war. The full scope of what was communicated, how and what risks the people involved took, was not part of the public narrative because the intelligence apparatus that managed these networks was not interested in public narratives about its methods. The deception operations that accompanied the Normandy planning are better known. Operation Bodyguard, which was designed to persuade German command that the primary Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, involved a range of methods including false signals traffic, fake military units, and a network of double agents. The double agents were individuals who had been recruited by German intelligence as spies and had then been turned by British intelligence and were providing false information to Germany. This is documented in the records of the British deception operation, which were classified for many decades. The false information these agents provided contributed to German decisions to keep forces in the Pas-de-Calais area rather than reinforcing Normandy after the landings. People died as a result of the decisions made by both sides on the basis of information that had been engineered. The engineering was successful from a military standpoint. The double agents involved lived with the knowledge of what they had done in ways that are documented in some cases in personal memoirs that were themselves subject to clearance processes before publication. The Allied bombing of transportation infrastructure in France before and after the Normandy landings was necessary to disrupt German supply lines to the invasion area. It was also lethal to French civilians. The pre-invasion bombing campaign killed approximately 10,000 French civilians. This was known in advance to be a likely consequence. The Allied command, including the political leadership in Britain and the American command, discussed the expected civilian casualties explicitly. They considered whether the operational necessity justified the casualties. They concluded that it did. The deliberations were classified. Charles de Gaulle objected, in classified communications, to the civilian toll of the bombing campaign on French territory. His objections were noted, and the bombing continued. The French civilians who died in the pre-invasion bombing were not a prominent part of the liberation narrative that was constructed around the Normandy campaign, for obvious reasons. They appear in the operational records as expected collateral damage within acceptable parameters. The war in the Pacific involved a component of American psychological operations that was detailed and carefully organized. American forces produced leaflets that were dropped on Japanese cities and on Japanese military positions. The leaflets told the truth in some cases and did not tell the truth in other cases. They were designed by people whose job was to understand what information would be most effective in producing the desired psychological effect, whether that was encouraging surrender, creating fear, or creating doubt about the Japanese military command. The psychological operations unit that produced these materials had access to intelligence about conditions inside Japan and inside Japanese military units that informed what they produced. Some of the materials referenced specific conditions that they knew would resonate because of intelligence collected through other means, the sources of which were not disclosed. The effectiveness of these operations was tracked. The results were classified. The materials themselves are available in archives and provide a detailed picture of how the American military thought about the Japanese population and about what levers it believed would move them. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 is presented in most accounts as a direct consequence of the atomic bombs. The internal deliberations within the Japanese government during the final weeks of the war present a more complicated picture. Japanese government records, which became available over time and have been analyzed by historians, show that the Japanese government was divided about the conditions under which it would accept surrender, and that the primary point of contention was not the atomic bombs specifically, but the question of the emperor's status. The Japanese leadership was not willing to accept unconditional surrender if it meant the abolition of the imperial institution. The American government knew this because it had broken the Japanese diplomatic code and was reading the communications between Tokyo and the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, who was attempting to arrange Soviet mediation of a negotiated peace. The American government chose not to address the emperor question publicly in a way that might have resolved the Japanese internal debate before the atomic bombs were used. The reasons for this choice are in the record. They include military planning considerations, domestic political considerations, and a genuine uncertainty within the American government about what approach would be most effective. They also include the fact that the bombs were ready, and that using them was the default plan, and that changing that plan required a decision of a kind that was not made. The decision not to change the default plan is in the documents. It is attributed to different reasons by different participants in their subsequent accounts. The documents themselves are more ambiguous than the subsequent accounts. The occupation of Japan after the surrender involved American decisions about which Japanese institutions and which Japanese individuals would be retained and which would be removed. The emperor was retained. The decision to retain him was made explicitly and on the basis of a calculation that his authority would be useful in implementing American objectives in occupied Japan. General Douglas MacArthur made this judgment, and it was accepted. The emperor's wartime role, the extent of his knowledge of and participation in decisions about Japanese military conduct, was the subject of internal American analysis during the occupation. Documents produced by the occupation authority show that there was awareness that a full accounting of the emperor's wartime role would complicate the decision to retain him. The approach taken was to construct a record of the Tokyo war crimes trials that did not examine the emperor's role in the same way it examined the roles of other Japanese leaders. Witnesses who might have implicated the emperor were managed carefully. Prosecutors were aware of the limits on what they were expected to pursue. The resulting trials prosecuted a set of Japanese leaders for crimes that were real and that were documented. They did not pursue the lines of inquiry that would have most directly implicated the imperial institution. This was documented in internal American communications about the trials. It was not part of the public presentation of the trials, which were presented as a comprehensive accounting. The American use of Japanese Americans in intelligence operations during the Pacific War represents a specific institutional reality that was classified for a long time. Japanese American soldiers served in the military intelligence service in large numbers, where their language skills were used to translate captured documents, to interrogate prisoners, and to monitor Japanese communications. The operational value of these individuals was extensively documented internally. The same military that had classified the populations from which these soldiers came as security risks and had interned their families used their skills extensively and knew they were using them effectively. The contrast between the public policy position and the operational reality was documented in classified assessments throughout the war. The people making the assessments and the people making the policy were not always different people. The disconnect between what the institution knew and what it maintained publicly is in the record. The partisans who fought German occupation in Yugoslavia, in Greece, in France, and in the occupied Soviet territories were supplied and in many cases organized with Allied assistance. The assistance was managed through intelligence channels that were separate from regular military command. The people who received that assistance did things with it that were not always consistent with what the Allied governments would have described as their objectives. Yugoslav partisans under Tito and the Chetnik forces under Mihailović fought each other as well as the Germans, and the intelligence reports available to Allied command documented this. The British decision to shift support from Mihailović to Tito was based partly on intelligence assessments about which force was more effective against the Germans, and partly on assessments about post-war political arrangements. The documentation of how that decision was made, including what was known about Tito's communist affiliations and what the assessment of post-war Yugoslavia would look like under his leadership, was classified. It reflects a decision made on the basis of immediate military advantage and acknowledged post-war political costs that were deemed acceptable. Mihailović was later captured by Yugoslav authorities and executed. The Allied governments that had supported him and then withdrawn that support in favor of his rival did not intervene. The record of their communications about his fate is available. The Soviet Union's wartime conduct toward its own citizens occupies a category in the record that is distinct from anything the Western Allies did, but that fits the same pattern of official narrative diverging from documented reality. The NKVD, the Soviet security and intelligence apparatus, functioned throughout the war as an instrument of both external intelligence collection and internal population control. Soviet citizens who were captured by the Germans and who survived captivity were treated on return as potential traitors. The logic was that they had been in contact with the enemy. The fact that the contact had been involuntary was not relevant to the institutional processing of their cases. Large numbers of returning Soviet prisoners of war were investigated. Significant numbers were imprisoned. Some were executed. This was documented in NKVD records. The documents are bureaucratic in their language. They describe the processing of cases, the application of categories, the movement of individuals through a system designed to handle large volumes quickly. The individuals appear in the documents as case numbers and categories. The system operated continuously throughout the war and in the years immediately following it. Soviet citizens of specific ethnic groups were deported during the war on the grounds of potential collective disloyalty. The Chechen and Ingush populations were deported in February 1944. The Crimean Tatars were deported in May 1944. The Volga Germans had been deported earlier in 1941. The deportations were carried out by the NKVD with military logistics support. The records of the deportations are detailed. They document the numbers of people moved, the transport methods, the destinations, the conditions. They also document the mortality that occurred during transport and in the early period of settlement in the destination areas. The mortality is a number in the records, like any other logistical figure. The deportations were authorized by Stalin through formal orders. The orders were executed through the normal bureaucratic apparatus. Officers received their assignments. Reports were filed. The people who were moved, who died in transit, who survived in the special settlements where they were deposited, appear in the documents as a managed population problem that was resolved through administrative means. The wartime research into chemical weapons conducted by all major powers during the conflict was more extensive than the public record maintained in the immediate post-war period reflected. The United States produced large quantities of chemical weapons during the war, including mustard gas and other agents. These weapons were not used in combat, but they were stockpiled and they were tested. The testing included exposure of American soldiers to chemical agents under controlled conditions. Some of these tests were conducted with the knowledge of the participants. Others were conducted under circumstances where the participants did not know what they were being exposed to or understood that they were participating in tests with hazardous materials but were not informed of the specific risks. The records of these tests are classified in significant part. Veterans who participated and who experienced long-term health effects from their exposure spent decades attempting to access their own medical records in connection with those tests, and in many cases were unsuccessful. The VA's handling of these cases was documented in congressional hearings conducted decades after the war. The documents showed that the information existed within the system and had not been provided to the individuals whose bodies the research had used. British chemical weapons research during the war included experiments conducted at Porton Down, the British military research facility, using British servicemen as subjects. The men who participated were in many cases told they were participating in research into protective equipment or treatments, not that they were being exposed to chemical agents for offensive research purposes. The Porton Down experiments continued after the war and involved a death in 1953 that became the subject of a police investigation many decades later. The wartime experiments are documented in the Porton Down records, which were classified and became available in part through freedom of information processes in the years following the conflict and in subsequent decades. The documents show a research program functioning within normal institutional parameters, with proper authorization, proper documentation, and improper disclosure to the subjects. The diplomatic record surrounding the Holocaust contains a specific and well-documented set of decisions by the governments of countries that had information about what was happening in German-occupied Europe, and that chose how to use that information. The British and American governments received reports about the systematic murder of Jewish populations in German-occupied territory from multiple sources beginning in 1942. The reports were assessed. They were found credible. The question of what to do with that information was discussed at multiple levels of both governments. The conclusions reached were that the primary response to the Holocaust was winning the war, and that specific actions directed at stopping or interrupting the killing, such as bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz or the facilities at Auschwitz itself, were either not militarily feasible or were not the most effective use of available resources. These conclusions were reached through normal decision-making processes involving real considerations about military priorities and real uncertainty about what specific actions would accomplish. They were also reached in an institutional context in which the lives in question, the lives of Jewish people in occupied Europe, were weighted in a way that is visible in the documents. The documents contained language about refugee problems and about what would happen if large numbers of Jewish refugees were released from Europe and sought entry to Britain or the United States. The considerations were real. They reflect institutional and political priorities that were real. The documents in which those priorities are expressed exist. The rescue of Jews from German-occupied Europe was impeded by the immigration policies of the countries most capable of providing refuge. The United States maintained immigration quotas during the war that were not fully utilized even as reports of mass murder became credible and then definitive. The State Department, which administered the immigration system, was the subject of an internal Treasury Department investigation in 1943 that produced a document called the Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The report, produced by Treasury officials, concluded that the State Department had been not merely passive, but actively obstructive toward efforts to rescue European Jews. It documented specific instances where information had been suppressed and where rescue proposals had been delayed or blocked. The report was the basis for Franklin Roosevelt's creation of the War Refugee Board in January 1944. The existence of the report and the process that produced it are documented and available. The State Department officials it implicated continued in their positions. The immigration system it described continued to operate as it had been operating. The War Refugee Board, created as a response to the report, operated with limited funding and limited authority. The strategic decisions that shaped the final months of the war in Europe included decisions about how to treat the retreating German military and the populations behind the rapidly moving front lines. The American military's advance through Germany in the spring of 1945 was accompanied by a set of experiences for the soldiers involved that were documented in unit records, in letters, and in after-action reports, and that were also subject to censorship by military postal censors who were instructed to identify material that reflected poorly on American conduct. The censorship was not total. Letters got through, but the institutional system for managing what images and descriptions of American conduct reached the American public was functioning throughout the final period of the war. The images of concentration camp liberation were released with specific intent. They were released because they served a clear purpose in the public narrative of what the war had been about. Other images from other contexts were managed differently. The managing was documented in the records of the Office of War Information and in the records of the military censorship apparatus. The system is available for examination. It shows an institution that understood the relationship between images and public understanding, and that managed that relationship with professional competence. The war ended. It ended through surrender documents and occupation agreements, and the establishment of international institutions designed to prevent a recurrence. The Nuremberg trials produced verdicts and in some cases executions. The Tokyo trials did the same. The United Nations was founded. The Geneva Conventions were revised. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. New international legal frameworks were constructed on the basis of the experience of the war, with the explicit purpose of ensuring that what had happened could not happen again. The scientists who had worked on chemical weapons programs continued working on chemical weapons programs under new national arrangements. The intelligence officers who had built networks using former Nazi assets maintained those networks through the Cold War. The military bureaucracies that had administered the internment of Japanese Americans, the segregation of black soldiers, and the management of prisoner-of-war populations reorganized themselves for the next conflict. The institutional knowledge that had made the war function, the administrative efficiency, the procedural competence, the capacity to manage large populations through paperwork and categories, was not dissolved when the war ended. It was retained because it was useful, and because the institutions that possessed it intended to continue existing, and because no accounting had required them to examine it.